I'm going to start by talking about some stuff, and feel free to chime in, ask any kind of question, play Stump the American Revolution, play whatever we want to. There will be actually a little bit of discussion of the topic for the winter and spring, which is, I'm going to follow up on some opening lines that I made 2 years ago when we were doing the talk about how the 1549 prayer book came to be, and every now and then I would say things like, oh, and that's not, but then in 1789 we changed it, yada, yada, yada. Well, what we're going to do this time is look at how the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America came to be. In particular, looking at how some of the stuff that goes on in the church today is not anything new, and also looking at how some of the terminology that we use in the church today has been around for the last 250 to 300 plus years, 400 years as a matter of fact, but we've changed how we define certain words. Okay. So anyway, we're going to do that, and as I said on Facebook, yes, it's history, but the other side of it is I will do everything in my power to make it interesting because I happen to love history. So,
and I hate history.
Well, see, that's what I like. I like a challenge. I just love a challenge, okay?
So we're going to get along fine.
Anyway, the story of Anglicanism in the colonies goes all the way back basically to 1585 to 1587. And that's when Sir Walter Raleigh came across and set up a colony.
Roanoke?
That's it, Roanoke Island.
Homeschooling my kids, otherwise I would not know.
It is believed that it did not last more than a year, and the exact date of that year is not really known because there is no indication of the colony whatsoever other than Raleigh returning to the court of Elizabeth I and presenting her, if you saw the movie Elizabeth, presenting her with tobacco leaves from the New World. The colony that we know about and we talk about is Jamestown. That was founded in 1607, and it was an expedition of men that came over principally from London, and they brought a chaplain with them, a man named Robert Hunt, who in June of 1607 presided over what was probably the first service of Holy Communion in the colonies. Anyway, the church was a major part of the Jamestown community. On Sunday morning, they had morning prayer. Sunday evening, they had an evening prayer. And in between, they had catechism so that everybody understood what their faith was all about. They began the process of preaching the gospel to the Native Americans, and did that because they believed that that would help unfold God's plan of salvation for the world.
Wasn't the Native American Bible like the first one printed here, or New Testament? Maybe it was just the New Testament.
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know the answer to that. The idea of preaching the gospel to people unknown attracted men in England into the priesthood. And so there were many candidates over the course of the early part of the history of the country who came over here to be priests, in particular in the Virginia colony. The interesting thing is that to be a priest, you had to have a university degree in England. And so you had a whole bunch of very well-educated clergy in and around, in particular, in and around Virginia. However, it was a tough life, and 44 of the 67 clergymen that came over before 1660 died within 5 years of getting here. So it was not the easiest time at all. The colonies, Virginia in particular, followed the English tradition of patronage. Okay? And that meant that an individual assumed responsibility for building a church and providing the financial support for the clergy person. That meant that the patron had the right to select the clergyman that he wanted. And I say he because we all know 400 years ago it was all he's.
Yeah.
Jamestown and the other settlements in Virginia created the idea of parishes around the church that the patron had established. The parish was not just the church building, but that whole area around it. And they used what's called the glebe system for income. And glebe is G-L-E-B-E, and a glebe is land that a patron designates for someone else. Comes from the Latin gleba, and that just means clod. You know, sometimes when you know the Latin roots of words, you think, oh my goodness, they couldn't have come up with something better. So, anyway, glebe was land within a parish that was used to support the priest. It could also include livestock that was on that land, any buildings that might have existed on that land, etc. When the first colony, when the people came over to Jamestown in 1607, James I was the monarch in England. And it was under James I, who ruled until 1625, I think. It was under James I that many people came and established colonies here in the U.S. So you had, in 1620, we all know that the Puritans arrived in what is now called Massachusetts, of course. And they arrived because they wanted more purification of Anglican worship than they were getting back home. The other interesting thing is that the Puritans were bigger supporters of Parliament and parliamentary government than they were of the Crown. Now, if you think back into British history, James I became the king when Elizabeth I died, but he was not a direct descendant of Elizabeth or of the Tudor house. He was from the House of Stuart in Scotland and was a distant cousin of Elizabeth's. So he was never really viewed in the 1600s as being the king. Except in Scotland, where he was James VI, and he was the real deal. Now, not only did the clergy have a tough time, but colonists often had a tough time. 80% of the colonists who arrived in Jamestown in 1607 were dead by 1610. But more ships kept bringing people. In England, there were a number of religious debates that were going on different fronts, and we won't get into the details of those, but they were a major distraction in England for Charles I, who was the son of James I, and then followed by the Protectorate of Oliver Cromwell, followed by James II and Charles II. And all of these theological, ecclesiastical debates did prove beneficial to the colonies, because while all of the religious leaders in England were wrapped up with all of these issues, the colonies were able to set up government and establish a way of life as they saw fit, without a lot of interference from England. In particular, in Virginia, they had to deal with all these clergy dying and restoring clergy. And so the colonial legislature adopted a plan to designate clergymen. the House of Burgesses would present to the governor of the Virginia colony names of people who seemed appropriate to be a priest. And the Burgesses would then, the governor would then make the appointment, and the House of Burgesses would then provide all of the legal regulations with regard to how to run the church. Okay? So, at the same time, in England, the idea of vestries was emerging and had come over on one of the many boats. The whole idea of having a vestry in a parish became part of life here.
So now it's not just one patron, it's a group of people who decide who the priest is going to be.
And over here, in Virginia in particular, with a colonial legislature in place, the idea of having vestries made perfect sense because it was a governing board. It was people being involved in the governance, not top-down, as was the case in the 1600s between the church and the crown in England. The Puritans brought the idea of vestries with them, and they loved the idea of vestries because it was lay leadership. As far as they were concerned, no bishops, no crown, none of that sort of stuff. By the 1630s, the vestries in Virginia began to nominate their own people to be parish priest. And by 1643, the House of Burgesses had gotten out of the business of appointing clergy. The vestry incorporated many of the religious statutes that the House of Burgesses had passed. They incorporated them into the parish life, and that actually gave rise to something in the 13 colonies that is very different than the rest of the Episcopal Church. Each colony had what are called by various names, basically religious corporation laws. And in some colonies, they go back to like 1700, and what they were the House of Burgesses or the state legislature in New York or Massachusetts attempting to tell churches how they would govern themselves. And in some states, I know that in New York in particular, I think in Massachusetts, some of those laws still govern how we do things today. And not just Episcopalians, but other denominations. One of the things in Virginia is that the House of Burgesses had said that once a clergyman was inducted into office, he had life tenure.
Really?
Yes. That didn't sit well in Massachusetts, for example. It didn't sit well in many other colonies. And so the end result was that the other colonies used one-year contracts for their clergy. Here in New England, the Puritans limited church membership to those who could testify to their conversion. In Virginia, which was heavily Anglican, it was, of course, are you baptized? Come to the water, solve that problem. In Massachusetts, in particular, church membership required that you show evidence of your conversion. Massachusetts also abandoned using the Book of Common Prayer. Now, bear in mind, in the early, mid-1600s, that would have been the 1559 Book of Common Prayer. The Puritans, by abandoning the Book of Common Prayer and saying that people had to testify to their conversion, they had this idea that if it really caught on here, they could export that back into England. Well, needless to say, that didn't happen, okay? But by the 1640s or so, we're under the reign of Charles I, and Charles I, even though he was the son of James I, James was married to a Roman Catholic, and Charles went back and forth between embracing Roman Catholicism and staying with the Anglican Church of England. Somewhere around 1640 or so, he gave a Roman Catholic named George Calvert permission to establish a colony here in the U.S. Anybody have any idea which of the 13 colonies that was?
Boston.
No. Thank you for playing.
Calvert, maybe one of the Carolinas?
No, it was Maryland. Maryland, George Calvert came to Maryland and established a colony there. In terms of life here in the U.S., a colony like Maryland, who got their charter, in essence, from the king, who was dabbling both in Anglicanism and Roman Catholicism, colonies like Maryland still supported the crown back in England. New Englanders supported Parliament. Okay? And the interesting thing is that many of the Puritans came from the area of England called East Anglia, which is sort of northeast of London, going towards the coast. And it was an area that had many Presbyterians living in it. And so they, of course, before they came over, were heavily influenced by John Knox and the thinking of Scottish Presbyterians who had come down into England. Virginia, again, having gotten their charter from the crown, supported the crown, okay? There was yet a third group of a third classification, for lack of a better phrase, of colonialists, and one might call them the dissenters, although I'm not sure that's the right word, but they took advantage of all of these this confusing political landscape and found a nice small piece of land and said, we're going to put our stake here, and we're not going to have anything to do with your parliament, we're not going to have anything to do with your crown, we're not going to have anything to do with anything except what we want.
Delaware? Delaware?
No, but go smaller.
New Jersey.
Rhode Island, Roger Williams. Rhode Island.
Actually, New Jersey's bigger than the two of those.
Roger Williams established a colony in Rhode Island that didn't want to have anything to do with the Puritans in Boston, didn't want to have anything to do with those Anglicans down there, further down the coast, who all supported the crown. We're going to create a real American religious community. So we had the Protectorate from roughly 1649 to 1662, and then 1660, I think it was. And
Protectorate is?
The Protectorate was, because of all of the religious controversies in England in the 1630s and 40s, a man named Oliver Cromwell, who was a Presbyterian, stepped in with Parliament's support to establish a government that would oversee England and Scotland apart from the crown. Because he was a Presbyterian and therefore not part of any Roman Catholic or Anglican background, one of the things that Cromwell was known for was going through various parts of the country and removing all statuary from the existing churches. And if you ever go to Ely Cathedral, which is in East Anglia, in that area that I mentioned a minute ago that the Puritans came from, if you go there, when you look at the outside of Ely Cathedral, you will see niches
with the statues
in the sides of the wall, which is where the statues were, but the statues long gone. Stained glass windows were removed and replaced with clear glass, or as clear as it would have been in 1650. But the whole idea was trying to puritize the Church of England. Anyway, Cromwell was removed from office in 1660, and the monarchy was restored with Charles II. Charles II being the son of Charles I, Charles II being like his father, half Roman, half Anglican, couldn't care less at one level, okay? But he did require that clergy that had been ordained during the Presbyterian years of Cromwell had to be reordained by bishops. Now, that might have been easy to do in England, but it got more difficult, of course, for clergy who had come over to the colonies. That led to clergy saying, I'm not going back and be reordained. Because, of course, bear in mind, no bishops in the colonies, right?
Right.
Okay, so I'm not going back and be reordained. And it led to people in England saying, this is ridiculous. I'm not going to be reordained. The ones in England who thought it was ridiculous came over, so we have more dissenters coming over to the colonies. And by the late 1660s, early 1670s in this country, you had more dissenting clergy than you had Church of England clergy. In other words, whether they were Puritan, whether they were called Anabaptist, whether they were called, it didn't matter what they were called, you had more clergymen that had come over here that did not view themselves as Church of England clergy. Virginia was the only colony that continued to have more Church of England clergy than any other version of clergy. And in 1680 or so, a parish in Virginia elected a rector who had not been reordained. So the whole controversy from England is now sitting right there in the lap of the state, or the colony of Virginia. Charles II died. Yes, Charles II died and was replaced by James II. James II ruled from 1685 to 1688. He was Charles's son. He was a Roman Catholic, and he espoused all Roman Catholic policy. Needless to say, that didn't go over really well because he introduced, or I should say reintroduced, Roman Catholic worship in universities. He arrested Anglican bishops who would not allow Roman Catholic services in their diocese, and in 1688 Parliament said, you're gone, out the door.
To the king.
To the king, right.
That they didn't have kings.
No, Charles II in 1660 came in as the king. Okay. Charles II came in as the king, and then his son succeeded him, but his son, who was openly Roman Catholic, antagonized Parliament enough that Parliament said, you're out of here. Okay? So now, we do have to take a moment and remember that the policies of these last two kings, of Charles II and James II, contributed directly to the growth of Presbyterians, Congregationalists, and other dissenting groups, not only in England, but over here in the colonies, okay?
And that's dissenting against Roman Catholicism and Church of England.
And Church of England. Which did not share a theology, but they shared a crown for all those years that was going back and forth, okay? Anyway, Charles and James both thought that if you encouraged religious toleration in the colonies, that would encourage toleration for Roman Catholicism at home. Goes to show you how they had no idea what the difference is with, 4,000 miles of an ocean, etc.
Just a little pond.
Just a little pond.
Across the pond.
Yeah.
Across the pond. But it did lead to them giving charters to William Penn for Pennsylvania, and giving the charter to Roger Williams for Rhode Island, okay? So they, in their own bass-backward way, they actually did something good for everybody. They did absolutely, they included no provision in the charters for New York, New Jersey, and the Carolinas. There was no provision in there for the Church of England. The Virginia Charter, of course, talked about the Church of England. Other charters talked about the Church of England, whether it was good or bad. But in giving the charters for the Carolinas, New Jersey, and New York, there was absolutely no mention by either king of Church of England. So, 1688, James has been booted out, and now England has to go and figure out where they're going to find a king. And as happened frequently in these last 200 years, it was, okay, you're related to him, and he's related to you, and you're related to her, and we know that she's got a brother in the Netherlands.
Who's related to someone
Who's related to someone, and his wife is related to someone,
who was a king.
and perhaps they would be willing to move to England.
Because maybe they think like us.
Because maybe they think like us. Don't laugh. You know how we laugh today about, oh, why do people think like this? Well, it's been going on for a long time, okay? So anyway, 1688. Parliament extends the invitation to William and Mary of Orange to come to England and lead the country, which they agreed to do. When they got there, they made some very practical decisions. They endorsed the 1662 Book of Common Prayer, which had been around but had not officially been endorsed by the government. So they endorsed it. They endorsed the 39 Articles, which had been around since the late 1500s, but as the Crown kept going back and forth, they had not been endorsed by Parliament. They were endorsed. They had Parliament pass an Act of Toleration for Protestant dissenters. In other words, instead of everybody leaving, let's see what we can do to see if we can't all live in the country together. And both of them said that Scotland would hereafter be Presbyterian, which of course made the Scottish happy. Now, that created two major impacts that are going to have an impact not only in England, but in the colonies, and frankly, in terms of who we are. The first impact was that they created something called the Royal Society. The Royal Society was a bold vision that William and Mary had that would join reason and faith in order to provide a pious alternative to all of the violence that had existed throughout the 1600s within the country of England, okay? In their mind, the Royal Society would bring peace to the church and progress and prosperity to the nation. They believed that you could solve religious controversies with reason just as you attacked scientific and mathematical problems.
Good luck for that.
Sounds like a plan.
Sounds like a plan, right? So, the first president of the Royal Society was Isaac Newton.
Oh, of course.
And one of its prominent members was John Locke. Both believed that the Christian faith was a reasonable faith, and that the propagation
Meaning that it was intellectually
intellectually concerned
discerned.
and discerned. Okay? So, they believed that the propagation, the spreading of it, okay, encouraged domestic peace, scientific advancement, and the success of the British Empire.
Isaac Newton, he did what?
Isaac Newton and John Locke believed that because the Christian faith was a reasonable faith, that the spreading of the Christian faith would increase domestic peace, scientific advancement.
I can't write all that.
Don't worry.
It's on video.
There's another name for this era.
The Enlightenment? Right.
Yeah, this is the beginning of the Enlightenment.
That apple must have been a rock.
That, oh, that was good. The apple must have been a rock. That was good. Well, the Royal Society, the other thing that happened when William and Mary came to the throne, beside the Royal Society, was the advent, the coming of Latitudinarian bishops. Now, when you see the word, you're going to understand, you'll figure this out in 2 seconds.
So they had like a strip of land that they did, and ladder, yeah.
Okay, don't laugh. You're laughing, and you shouldn't be.
So they had like strips of land going across like this, only in England.
Yeah, not quite.
Okay.
Let's back up for a second. When William and Mary became king and queen, all Scottish bishops, the Archbishop of Canterbury and 7 English bishops refused to swear allegiance to them. Because remember what I said, you know him and he knows her and you know him, and
Yeah.
that's how they got William and Mary. Okay, so these
They
bishops,
were arguing that they really weren't blood,
they really weren't blood, they really weren't English, and
therefore had no
therefore had
right to be king.
no right, okay? So they refused to swear allegiance. They were called the non-juring bishops. Just a fancy term
For sticks in the mud.
for saying,
You're out of compliance.
right, that's very good. Fancy way of saying you're out of compliance, okay? Parliament and the monarchs removed these bishops and replaced them with bishops who were sympathetic to the Royal Society and the budding Enlightenment. They were looking for bishops who believed that if one stressed practical morality and philanthropy rather than doctrinal points, it would be easier to show the reasonableness of the Christian faith.
Is that where all the saints come in?
No, the saints have been around, but they're in Rome at the moment. They're in the Roman Church, okay?
Okay, so I'm going ahead of myself here.
So these new bishops argued for wider tolerance in the Church of England.
Let's emphasize that point again. They thought that philanthropy and being morally upright was the evangelistic method
Right,
for spreading the good news.
right.
As opposed to
the good news, okay? As opposed to preaching from the gospel, as opposed to all of that, they believed that how you lived your life and how you spent your money said more about the Christian
Well,
life.
let's make the connection to life within our time. How many Episcopalians, well, we can say that it's pretty much a given in the Episcopal Church that Episcopalians have assumed that Christian faith is about being good, putting money in the plate. You know, it isn't necessarily about knowing God.
Right. And
It's just about,
it's not necessarily about knowing God or knowing God. It's about all these other things.
Checking off the...
Check off the checklist.
Okay.
That's exactly it. So anyway, these new bishops questioned the need for heated debates over topics like predestination, regeneration. Now, regeneration is what happens at baptism, that you are made new by being brought into the body of Christ, okay? These new bishops said that the 39 articles could support any of these positions. Now, when you have nothing to do and you can't go to sleep,
Read the 39.
read the 39 articles. You might be able to find that to be true, but I don't think so. Anyway, because they took this broad approach, they were called Latitudinarians. In other words, there was latitude, lots of latitude. Which is why when you were saying this, well, you weren't totally off, okay? The Latitudinarian bishops did recognize the importance of these colonies, because the colonies would bring prosperity to England. Now, William and Mary did have an effect on this side of the pond. They lobbied the legislatures in the colonies for a government-sponsored establishment of the Church of England in each colony. They had some success in Maryland, even though its patron had been Roman Catholic. They definitely had success in South Carolina. Okay, Virginia was already there. They had a modest amount of success.
We're just not going to go there.
No, we're not. Modest amount of success in New York, but utterly unsuccessful in New Jersey and Pennsylvania.
What about Rhode Island?
And modest, very little success in Rhode Island. And I say very little because at this time is when Trinity Newport was indeed established. But the colonists were basically reacting to the fact that they were just tired of, they were becoming tired of this back and forth, who's in charge in England, and now you're going to tell me on this side of the pond that I've got to do things differently. Under William and Mary, and then under their successor, Anne the First, Anglican parishes were established in places where they had not been before. King's Chapel in Boston was established in 1688, Christ Church in Philadelphia, 1694, Trinity in New York, 1697, Trinity Newport, 1698, St. Mary's Burlington, New Jersey, 1703, and Christ Church, Stratford, Connecticut in 1707. So they got a few places set up. We're going to deal with one more thing, and then we'll have to call it a day, I think. It was under William and Mary that the Bishop of London decided to try yet another way to have influence on the colonies, and that was called the commissary system. The commissary for Virginia was a man named James Blair, and he wanted to establish order in the church in Virginia. Now bear in mind, the church in Virginia is now, in the early 1700s, is pretty close to 100 years old in one way, shape, or form, and the House of Burgesses has been saying how things are going to be run, right? So James Blair comes over from London, and he establishes the convocation system. Now, the convocation system was a way of trying to divide the church into smaller units for conversation, governance, and things like that. So it was the commissary who did this. He came over and said that they had to enforce the morality laws. And he called for an annual meeting of all of these convocation and the establishment of ecclesiastical courts. So all of a sudden, we're beginning to see 100 years in the organizational life of the church in this country changing. Among the other things that James Blair did was he standardized the value of tobacco, because tobacco was how they were paying the clergy. And he founded the College of William and Mary. The weakness to the commissary system, well, let's say this, let's say the positive. As long as the colonists were in agreement with the commissary, everything worked out really well. But when it came to church matters, the commissary lacked the canonical authority of the bishop. So the commissary couldn't say anything about who became a priest or any of that sort of stuff. And it was hard for the commissary to discipline errant priests. So in 1706, 100 years after they arrived, New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania sent delegates to London arguing for a colonial episcopate, in other words, a bishop for the colonies. Queen Anne told her ministers to prepare legislation, but died before it ever got to Parliament. She was succeeded by George I. Now, if you thought you knew him and he thought you knew her brother in the Netherlands, well, then Lisa knew Linda's fifth cousin 4 times removed who lived in Germany.
So that's where George came from?
George came from Germany and spoke no English.
Ay. Ay.
It's been tough to develop that British accent.
So George came over and became George I. He could have cared less about the colonies, about the church, so he designated all of that stuff to the Prime Minister and to Parliament. In the meantime, on this side of the pond, there was much rethinking about having a bishop for the colonies, because there was great fear that all that would do is perpetuate the situation that they had walked away from in England. Under George, the 2 main parties in England were the Tories and the Whigs. The Whigs were largely Presbyterian, and they wanted to restrain bishops. The Tories had many Roman Catholic supporters among them, and they supported the hereditary rights of James II, the one that they had booted out in 1688. Well, with George I on the throne, who couldn't care less, he supported the Whigs, meaning the Presbyterians, and the Royalists, who were Royalists to James II, began to flee for fear of their own life. Anyway, next week we're going to look at the Great Awakening, which will happen in the 1700s and will once again reshape not only Anglicanism over here, but it's going to add a new denomination, 2 new denominations to the whole experience.
What year was that? 1700?
Which?
The Great Awakening.
Well, that'll be in the 1740s.
So up until now, we've had Presbyterians, Church of England's.
Some Congregationalists
And-
don't think of Congregationalists today, per se,
Okay, and then Catholics.
and Catholics.
So, the Puritans, what did they fall under?
Well, the Puritans fell under what we would probably today call general Protestantism,
Okay.
meaning
They weren't
non-denominational.
They weren't specifically Church of England, but they were close to.
They came out of Church of England because Church of England did not reform as far as they wanted them to.
Okay.
And that's going to become
So
even clearer,
we've already got 5 different groups,
at least.
at least,
Right.
not counting all the congregationals. Okay. And we're going to get more.
And we're going to get more.
One of the other repercussions of what happened early on had to do with property. We didn't experience until this century, and churches began to split from the Episcopal Church,
Okay.
and older churches that were incorporated prior to the creation of the Episcopal Church argued that they could keep their property because they were under the Articles of Incorporation, under the colonies.
Which didn't always work.
Which didn't always work, but it was an interesting argument.
And South Carolina is one of the places where that argument went right up to the South Carolina Supreme Court.
Okay, so
I think also in Virginia.
So
Yes,
they
yes.
were trying to say that, yeah, we signed on to this new thing, but really, we're not really a part of it because we were originally this thing. Or
Well,
something.
no one gave
Is
it
it
much thought
possible to get like
until
a list of
lawsuits.
everything, like you
started to
talked
occur.
about, like the
And,
dates? of-
Yeah,
of
I'll have that next week.
Okay.
I'll have that next